Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this important and timely conversation on military family food insecurity. My name is Kate Kuzminski, and I am the Senior Fellow and Program Director for the Military Veterans and Society Program here at CNAS. Our program focuses on military personnel policy, veteran and military family issues, and civil-military relations. In November 2021, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin made an announcement prioritizing efforts to address military family food insecurity. As part of the Secretary's emphasis, DoD rolled out resources for unit and installation commanders to help identify those service members in their units who were struggling with food security. Secretary Austin further called on the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness to provide a strategy and implementation plan to strengthen military family food security within 90 days. At the time Austin made the announcement, we saw a lot of confusion among the national security community. Even military journalists who have extensive experience with military personnel issues took to Twitter scratching their heads. How is it that military families who are provided housing and food allowances struggling with food insecurity? Particularly since installations provide many of the resources needed for military families. This moment provided a good opportunity for public education on the topic. Military families are certainly not the only individuals facing food insecurity. The compounding effects of inflation, rapid growth in housing costs, and the lack of available, affordable childcare are forcing many Americans to make incredibly difficult financial decisions. But there are some specific variables tied to military service that make food insecurity much more acute for service members. One of the largest areas of concern for military service members is a requirement to move frequently, referred to as a permanent change of station or PCS move. Many military families PCS every 2 to 3 years, frequently over the summer at the peak of the housing market. Rapid growth in the cost of rents over the past 2 years meant that housing costs were outpacing the analysis and adjustment of the basic allowance for housing. Additionally, service members also frequently move between low cost of living areas and high cost of living areas, meaning that the cost of basic items may skyrocket for a service member moving from Fort Polk, Louisiana to Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, or from Fort Riley, Kansas to the National Capital Region. While civilians have the ability to consider the financial trade-offs of a move before undertaking a new opportunity, service members do not have that option. Service members are also locked into their period of enlistment or the completion date of an officer's commitment. As such, they do not have the option to pursue better economic opportunities. Service members' spouses who would prefer to be employed face a number of barriers as well. Short-term moves for military schooling make it nearly impossible to pursue employment. Frequent moves result in frequent job changes, and increasingly, childcare shortages near military installations make full-time employment for a spouse either cost ineffective or impossible. Why does this topic matter to the American public, especially given that many civilians are also facing this financial difficulty? Food insecurity and financial instability among military families is a readiness issue. At a time when all of the services are facing recruiting shortfalls, the challenge of food insecurity can be yet another barrier to an individual's propensity to serve. For those currently serving who aren't able to feed their families, the issue can lead to a lack of focus in training or operations, yielding negative outcomes for force readiness. While DoD and Congress are investing time and energy into identifying the root causes of military family food insecurity, service providers and military family researchers have been sounding the alarm for years, many of them prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has added increased attention to the issue. Joining us today, we are very fortunate to have both a service provider and a researcher of military families. So from the service provider perspective, we are honored to be joined by retired Rear Admiral Charlie Williams, who currently serves as the Armed Services YMCA's Chief Operating Officer and Chief Program Officer. In his current capacity, he is responsible for the Armed Services YMCA's programmatic growth and the standardization and measurement across each of their 13 branches. Prior to his service with the Armed Services YMCA, Charlie spent over 30 years as an active duty naval officer, culminating in promotion to the rank of Rear Admiral and commanding ships, squadrons, and task forces. We are also joined by Dr. Jessica Strong, who serves as the co-director of applied research at Blue Star Families. She focuses on the Blue Star Families Military Family Lifestyle Survey, which, for those of you who aren't aware, is the premier longitudinal survey data on military spouses and military families, and something that we at CNAS use quite a bit, rely on quite a bit in our research. So welcome to Charlie and Jessica. I'm going to provide an opportunity for each of you to introduce yourselves, but also kind of give us a sense of what your organization does and what you're seeing. So Charlie, I'll start with you. Your organization meets the needs of military families and veterans at the community level. What trends have you seen in the demand for services at Armed Services YMCAs across the country?
Kate, thanks very much for, first of all, the opportunity to be here today. It's a fantastic opportunity and very important and very timely discussion. I think you covered who I am pretty well in your opening. I had the honor and the privilege of serving for more than 30 years in the Navy. And when I transitioned in 2018, I had the great fortune to land with the Armed Services YMCA, where I continue to serve here. So back to your question, if I may, I'd like to start with a few points about Armed Services YMCA. First of all, we are the oldest continually serving military support organization in the country. We celebrated our 160th birthday last year, and we work every day to help service members and their families navigate the challenges of military life. While we are part of the greater YMCA of the USA organization, we are an independent national nonprofit that tailors our programs and services to serve active duty military with a priority focus on junior enlisted service members and their families from each military branch and the Coast Guard. Last year alone, Armed Services YMCA served more than 136,000 individuals, and we did that through now 12 branches. Sorry, I need to update my bio. Now 12 branches and 330 staff nationwide. We also served another 4,000 military children through our affiliate partners, which are traditional YMCAs plus a couple of DoD facilities that deliver our programs and services where we don't have a physical presence ourselves. Now, like the rest of the world and the nation, what we considered normal business changed when the pandemic hit in March of 2020. Our child development centers, as an example, were still in high demand, but they were cut significantly in their capacity in order to comply with local, state, or federal guidelines. Our community food programs became a primary enterprise-wide focus. A little bit of context first. In 2019, pre-COVID, we served an average of about 15,000 military families and distributed almost 400,000 pounds of food on an annual basis. In 2020, in the heart of COVID, we saw a dramatic fourfold increase in food distribution in the second quarter of that year compared to the first quarter. Our organization quickly pivoted food aid from being an ancillary service to a primary effort, and sustainable food support increased from 7 of our 12 branches to 9 of our 12. By the year end in 2020, we had served more than 40,000 military families and distributed 1.9 million pounds of food. Now, in 2021, the interesting part here is that we actually served more military families. We served 60,000 in 21, about a 50% increase over 2020. But we actually distributed slightly less food total, about 1.5 million pounds of food as opposed to 1.9 million, which tells us, I think, that the demand became something more episodic, perhaps returning to a pre-COVID, more episodic demand than it had been at the heart of COVID. As an enterprise, we're running now an ongoing sustainable food support program at 9 branches. We added 2 more in 21 to make it 11 out of 12. And we plan to bring our 12th branch, the Fort Leonard Wood branch in Missouri, online with a program this year. We've also connected some of our YMCA affiliate partners with local military populations in their own areas to provide additional support. Now, as you mentioned, DoD Secretary Austin announced in November of last year their commitment to strengthening economic security in the force, which addresses both financial readiness and food insecurity. His memo stated that we must eliminate the stigma that many feel when seeking help, particularly when it comes to accessing food, and we must encourage everyone to use available resources. We were really thrilled to see this kind of a statement from Secretary Austin and thrilled to see DoD recognize the challenge that military families are facing in that regard. 2022, the trend has become a little bit more interesting with perhaps additional security and economic pressures. In the first quarter of this year, we experienced an uptick in food support, perhaps due to European deployments and everything going on with Ukraine. We saw in Fort Hood and Fort Bragg concern from military spouses expressed about especially the need for school-age childcare. And that really is focused on before and after school programs and summer day camps. I'm here at our branch right now in Hampton Roads, actually on travel, and they're starting their summer camps up this week. And I have quite a program going serving the greater Hampton Roads area. In May of this year, our Armed Services YMCA National Board of Directors approved food assistance as a core service enterprise-wide. We plan to get that 12th and final branch up and running this year, as I mentioned earlier, at Fort Leonard Wood. Now, with inflation and record gas prices that families are seeing, we see a conflict because with inflation, families are probably in need of food support more. With gas prices, we see a downturn in their willingness to drive to go get the food support. So that's driving some adjustments for us in messaging to encourage families to carpool, and also driving perhaps a delivery method change in making a more mobile program for us across our branches. So I hope I addressed your question and look forward to follow on.
Yeah, that's really informative. We really appreciate that. And I should note for our audience, you do have the ability to submit questions for Charlie and Jessica as we move forward. So please feel free to use the function to submit your Q&A questions. So Dr. Strong, turning to you, you've addressed this through a research perspective in your experience, and you have run probably the best survey of military spouses and military families on an annual basis for quite some time now. What trends have you seen in the data regarding financial security and food insecurity over time? And are there any changes pre-COVID to where we're at today?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here today. It warms my heart to no end to hear that you guys use the research that we're doing as part of the Military Family Lifestyle Survey. So thank you for that. I also wanted to say it's such a joy to be here, not only as a researcher, but also as an active duty enlisted spouse. I didn't include that in my bio, but I probably should have. And I wanted to share a brief story that illustrates some of the points that you made earlier about relocating from a low cost of living area to a high cost of living area. So because I come to this with personal experience, just like Charlie does, I remember the story of when we moved from a low cost of living to a high cost of living area as a junior enlisted from Fayetteville, North Carolina to New Jersey, just outside of New York City. We went from owning our own house to renting an apartment, like a level of a house, and still the housing costs tripled, even without including utilities. And that was a huge sticker shock at that time. And I was pregnant with our first child, and I had just left my full-time job because we relocated. And I remember calling around looking for childcare prices for an infant just outside of New York City. And they told me the cost for a month that was higher than that rent payment, which was already triple our mortgage payment. And I remember just being able to choke out, okay, I'm gonna have to call you back, hanging up the phone and going, why did I think we could afford to have children? Like, it's too late now, we're already in this. So I come to this with both that lived experience and the research that Blue Star Families does. I have the joy of leading the Blue Star Families Applied Research team. Blue Star Families is a national nonprofit that does not only research, but runs a plethora of programs to support military families. In order to start that, though, the first thing that they did, this group of military spouses that founded Blue Star Families in 2009, first thing they did was create this military family lifestyle survey. Because if you're going to advocate for a population, you kind of need to know what the issues are that you want to advocate around. So they instituted the first military family lifestyle survey in 2009, and we've been fielding it annually ever since. So some of those years we've been able to collect information on food insecurity and financial insecurity as a broader perspective. Blue Star Family started looking at food insecurity in 2016, asking our MFLS respondents about their food insecurity and their use of food support programs like SNAP, food stamps, WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program, the School Lunch Program, and a series of others. And we ask it every other year because we have noticed there isn't a lot of change in between the years. Although the samples were different in 2016 and 2018, the proportions of respondents reporting food insecurity and food support program participation remained pretty similar. About 7% of our active duty family respondents and 12 to 14% of our veteran family respondents self-reported that someone in their household faced food insecurity in the past year. Similarly, between 8 and 9% of our active duty families and 16 to 18% of our veteran families said that someone in their household had sought emergency food assistance from a food pantry or food bank or a charitable organization like Armed Services YMCA in the past year. So we noticed that those were pretty consistent. In 2020, at the start of the pandemic, we normally field in about April or May of the year, but in 2020, because of COVID, we shifted back to fielding in September and October. So in September and October of 2020, we moved to using the USDA food insecurity scale, which both allowed us to compare military family food insecurity to the civilian population using the same scale, and allowed us to gauge families that were experiencing high food security, moderate food security, and then low and very low food security. And we found that among enlisted active duty families, food insecurity rates were higher than the national average, higher than the civilian population, which caused, as you noted, a lot of surprise. Whenever I briefed people on that, they were like, that can't be right. I mean, you've got housing allowances, you've got a food allowance, you've got a regular paycheck. How can military families be food insecure? Well, unsurprisingly, enlisted military families reported higher levels of food insecurity than their officer family peers. But more surprising was that level of food insecurity was so high. It was 14% of all enlisted active duty families, including not just junior enlisted, not just E1 to E4, but all of them, E5 and above as well. Now it was higher in junior enlisted, yes, but it existed across all the enlisted ranks. And this examination also helped us point towards potential causes of problems, which you've already touched on a little bit, spouse unemployment being a primary reason. We found in that analysis that among our enlisted spouses who need or wanted to work, but were not employed, food insecurity rates were about 20%, but it was half that among spouses who were employed. So we know that there's a significant difference between those families who have an employed spouse and families who don't. And that relationship between spouse unemployment and food insecurity has also disproportionately impacted military families of color. So active duty families of color reported twice the level of food insecurity as their white non-Hispanic counterparts, 14% versus 7%. Now, this might be because families of color are disproportionately concentrated in enlisted ranks as opposed to officer ranks, and they are therefore more likely to be food insecure, but it's also because of spouse employment. Military spouses of color are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than their white non-Hispanic peers. And when they are employed, their earnings are significantly less. So we continue to keep tabs on these issues and continue to explore it. In fact, our 2022 Military Family Lifestyle Survey is fielding right now. It's open until July 10th, and it continues to ask these questions about food insecurity and financial readiness in military families. And we look forward to sharing the results with you guys again next year at the beginning of, and in March 2023.
That's great. And that's a good reminder if there are any military spouses watching to take advantage of the survey because the more respondents, as we all know, the better the data is and the better the policy recommendations, the more powerful they can be. So I'm going to turn back to Charlie. As you noted, the Armed Services YMCA is a nonprofit and it stands alone outside of DoD. DoD and the services and installations, they do provide services for service members and their families. I'm thinking of programs like the Army Emergency Relief Fund, Air Force Emergency Financial Assistance. But we've seen that those programs have been underutilized and they may not be used by people who truly need them. How do you see, or what do you see are some of the challenges or impediments to service members seeking those services that are provided by their installation? And how does their apprehension to use the services through their installation affect the local nonprofit community meeting those same needs?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Kate. It's one that we've been struggling with ourselves. Quite frankly, Armed Services YMCA is not the expert in this regard, but we have our ear to the ground. We do partner with the services. I have this conversation at every branch, at every garrison command when I visit about how we can partner to help bring service members and their families to the table at places like Army Community Services or Family Services in the Navy or wherever we are. And also, we partner with those relief agencies. In fact, quite honestly, I learned very recently, my former command master chief of mine is the executive director of Navy Marine Corps Relief here in the Hampton Roads area. So I'm going to consider him a great source for me to get smarter on after this conversation. All that said, as I mentioned, we're not really the expert, but I will say that in March of 2020, when COVID really hit the onset and people we started seeing that impact across the country. I think that's when each aid association started seeing the demand signal drop. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was uniform across the board for each relief association. Maybe, I could point to two reasons that I would speculate about as being contributors to why that demand dropped at each association. One would be, frankly, the access. With everything going on with COVID, it seems like such a long time ago, but it's only been 2 years. I think people were perhaps hesitant to go out and about and seek that in-person support that they might have needed or might have sought otherwise. I understand also, and this is just speculation, that perhaps some of the COVID financial support being provided, both federal and state, was a contributor to the drop in demand for support from aid associations. Again, not our bailiwick. This is a little bit of speculation on my part. But I do understand that as COVID has, transcended to the point that it is now, and that financial assistance, I believe, has terminated across the board, we're starting to see the demand at the aid associations restored to their, I think, historic numbers. Now, all that said, whatever path the individuals that need support do take, whether that's through an aid association or through a nonprofit like Armed Services YMCA, that's what we're here to do and here to support. We had our own recently completed strategic review, and during that process, we heard time and again from our members that they knew we offer support without judgment, which I think is a key element to any military family wanting to go and get that support. I know from personal experience, and Dr. Strong, you're the same way. I think military families are very proud, and going someplace and not being judged for needing support is a critical element to their being willing to go and get that support. So we heard from them that they see us as a home away from home, their words, and that we offered, that support without judgment. Toward that effort, we addressed financial insecurity as a priority for our organization to address that among active duty military families. And we know that the military really does an awful lot. I'd say absolutely everything in their power to make sure that no soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine are left behind. Now, organizations like ours come into play to make sure that no military family is left behind by providing access to things like food assistance and access to affordable childcare to enable spouse employment and get at that financial insecurity problem. We also know that military leaders at all levels in every branch of service are committed to the health and well-being of our service members and their families. And frankly, organizations like Blue Star Families, Armed Services YMCA are equally committed to that same level of support and ensuring that no military family is left lacking.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's a couple of other issues at hand too. A lot of the emergency relief that's provided through the services require an individual to go through their chain of command, and sometimes the topic or the issue of not being able to support your family is a shame. It feels like a shameful one, and then having to go through your boss to essentially say that's where you're at. I think that makes it a little tough too, and I think that is why it's so important that there are a network of resources around military installations that help with that.
I agree.
So, Dr. Strong, in your research, you've looked not just at food insecurity, but at an interconnected web of issues that lead to food insecurity or financial instability. Can you talk us through some of the other factors and what the financial pressures are facing military families?
Absolutely, I'd love to. Well, we spoke a little bit about one of them already, and I think the primary one that's on everybody's mind is spouse employment, because that I think is the linchpin to a lot of the issue around military family financial insecurity. But more broadly, there's other pieces that are attached to that. As we've already sort of talked a little bit about, childcare and housing prices are two of the financial stressors that also impact spouse employment and also impact military family financial security. We know that from our research, we know that because of frequent relocation, limited childcare, and long and unpredictable service members' day-to-day job demands, military spouses face a lot of barriers to employment. The unemployment rate for military spouses, at least in our survey, is about 4 to 6 times greater than the national unemployment rate. And moreover, despite a lot of effort on this issue, it hasn't significantly decreased since 2012. So it's been 10 years and it's been relatively similar that entire time. At the same time, we know that it's really important for millennial military families in particular to have 2 incomes. 70% of our millennial military family respondents in 2018 said having 2 incomes is vital to their family's well-being, whether that is financial well-being or also, emotional mental health well-being, because there's some purpose attached. For many spouses, there's purpose attached to employment. The military lifestyle, therefore, with all the relocations, can contribute to military families' financial insecurity because it inhibits spouses' ability to work. That limited childcare affordability is another piece. Also availability, but affordability is a big piece of it. As I alluded to earlier, that affordability piece is where you decide, is it even reasonable for me to work if I'm spending more than I'm going to make in childcare? It also continues to be a major financial stressor for military families. Of our active duty family respondents who reported that they were financially stressed and that they have a need for childcare, out-of-pocket childcare was the most commonly reported contributor to financial stress. One thing that I think is important to point out is that when you're doing your family budget, when you're looking at the numbers that can't change are what you're spending on housing or rent. That doesn't change. Utilities changes a little bit. You can adjust that a little bit. What you're paying for childcare, you can adjust to some degree, but you still need a certain amount for work. But the one piece that the largest cost that you have that is variable and where you can cut corners is going to be food. So if housing and childcare take up a significant portion of your family's budget, the only thing left to squeeze is food. So we know that childcare cost and affordability is a major component of this. Another major financial stressor, especially in the past couple of years, is out-of-pocket housing expenses. So we know today military families receive a basic allowance for housing, and that's pegged to 95% of the local area rent, where we have military families that are expected to do a cost share of 5% of the local area rent. But that doesn't take into two things. A, that doesn't take into account the cost of a school district, a quality school district for military families. And B, we know that military families are spending considerably over what that cost share is expected to be. We know in 2020, the cost share was expected to be between, that 5% was expected to be between like $75 and $168 per month for military families. But the large majority of our respondents are spending well over $200 a month over their BAH. So they're well over what their cost share is anticipated to be. And a lot of that is because they're choosing to live in school district, like housing that has good school districts, because most of our military families have children, and most of those children are relocated from school to school to school with every relocation. So balancing their kids' education with the cost of the housing is one of those impossible choices that military families have to make. That choice between financial security and a quality education for my child, whose education has been disrupted multiple times because of our family's military service. And this has only intensified in the past year when our skyrocketing housing prices have far outstripped our BAH rates. And the limited availability of housing means there's not many choices for military families, not many things for military families to choose from. So, for example, we have a couple of quotes that I wanted to share from the 2022 MFLS that's fielding right now. One quote is, "Very few rentals available, all well over BAH, all with dozens, if not hundreds of applications." A second respondent said, "The average is $1,000 for over BAH for houses that barely meet our needs for bedrooms, etc. Very few rentals here except pets." Pets is another piece. "And there's no availability within a 45-minute drive." So these are the choices that military families are having to make around, do I cut corners in housing? Do I cut corners in childcare? Do I cut corners in food? That all contribute to financial insecurity and therefore contribute to this food insecurity problem. And we know that the problem of food insecurity is not going to be addressed by one solution. Childcare is a piece of it. Spouse employment is a piece of it. Housing prices and BAH is a piece of it. But we need all of these solutions, multiple solutions to address these multiple interconnected financial issues that lead to food insecurity.
Yeah, and there's certainly the challenge too of rising BAHs affecting the market price of renting to military families, and sometimes that can turn into a spiral in and of itself. So we have some audience questions rolling in, and this is a good reminder to our audience that you can submit your questions through the Q&A function on the CNAS website. So I'll pose the first question from Joe and tack on some additional questions for each of you. So Joe's question is, who should take the lead to address military family food insecurity? Should it be the Pentagon? Should it be the military services? Should it be military service organizations and veteran service organizations, the private sector, Congress? And I'll throw out there that right now, we're seeing, the NDAA is really trying to tackle this. There have also been initiatives posed earlier from, I can think of one from Representative Sanford Bishop, who's looking at it through the Agricultural Oversight Committee. One challenge that we see is that BAH, the housing allowance, is considered on top of base pay when military families go to apply for things like WIC or SNAP, and that it puts them just out of reach of being able to be considered for those benefits. So there's been a movement afoot to kind of delink the housing allowance from it so that families who need those benefits are able to apply for them. Certainly, the Department of Defense has a number of initiatives underway. But if you were king or queen for a day and you were advising, who would be the organization or entity that you'd want to speak to, and B, what would your recommendations be? I'll throw that to Charlie first.
And thanks very much, Kate. That's a great question. And I think you captured it really well, including all of the second and third order things that you mentioned. I'm not going to shy away from this, but I do honestly believe that it's not any one organization that has to or should take lead per se. I mean, ultimately, look, I served for 33 years in the Navy. Ultimately, the things that go on within the military branches, and that includes their families, comes down to that five-sided building in the Pentagon and DoD and the military branches within it. But I also believe that the military and the branches are already focused on it, and it's the kind of a challenge that is going to take partners like the military service organizations and the private sector, and yes, Congress as well, to understand the problem, understand the challenge, and then actually come up with a long-term plan to get at it. This is not something that's going to be corrected overnight, and it's not going to be corrected by any one organization. So every time I visit a branch and a military base and a garrison command or a local command, I just emphasize the word partnership and the complementary services that an organization like Armed Services YMCA is built to provide and is here to provide, not in anything other than a real partnership with the DoD.
I'll turn it over to you, Jessica. If you were queen for a day and you were speaking to a legislator or someone in the building, what policy or legislative moves would you like to see?
Well, and in the same way, like I don't want to put the onus on just one organization or one person, because it is not a single, it's not a single issue. It is multiple issues. I think the things that will move the needle the most is addressing the housing, the BH and housing, addressing spouse employment in a real tangible way. And that comes from all different places. So that comes from like Congress and state legislators have the ability to protect military spouses from discrimination, which is one of the things that we hear from spouses that's a barrier to employment as well, in addition to childcare. Military service organizations have the ability to help with childcare, like Armed Services YMCA, but that also lies with the Pentagon. It also lies with the private sector, with private childcare agencies and childcare centers and nannies and babysitters that are near military installations. So there's lots of ways to solve each of these problems, the issue of childcare, the issue of housing, the issue of spouse employment, and everybody has the piece that they can do. No one thing is going to fix all of it, but there are some places, some levers that have a little bit more power than others. So I think I hate to shy away from it too, but it really is everybody's issue.
Yeah, we're doing some research here at CNAS on the shift to remote employment and what opportunities that might open up for military spouse employment. And there's a lot of onus that is placed then on employers, but it also requires quite a bit of assistance from state laws, state tax laws, and incentives. And DoD involvement, and even getting at that as a potential solution has only highlighted the issue of affordable, reliable childcare is still necessary for individuals who are building a career, though it might be remote and might give them more access. And then we run into issues of internet accessibility on certain military installations, or the surrounding areas is not consistent and doesn't allow for that. And so there's a number of interconnected issues, even for that particular solution set. Another audience question that we've received is, so thinking about what metrics might we look at to track or predict where there might be military family food insecurity and get ahead of it? Is total household income and family size the best indicator or metrics to look at? Are there other areas that we could look at to potentially forecast where there might be challenges and preemptively meet those needs? I'll throw that to Jessica.
Yeah, let me start there. So let me start by saying that we have not done a rigorous analysis that looks at all of the potential predictors of food insecurity. So some of this is speculation based on some of the research that we've previously done, but this is not a rigorous model that we've conducted. I do want to also highlight that one of our colleague organizations, MFAN, has just published a study, a causal factors study, doing some journey mapping with families who have experienced food insecurity and kind of what got them to where they are right now. So that is also a really interesting depiction of the problem of food insecurity in military families. To answer the question about income and family size being the best indicator, I don't know that it's the best, but it is one of the indicators, certainly. The bigger your family, the smaller your household income, the more you have to make those dollars stretch to feed all the people in the family. So certainly that is one of the primary indicators that I think is going to predict food insecurity. Spouse employment is a key factor in total household income. We know the military income is pretty stable. We know exactly how much those military service members are going to make. So the spouse's income is kind of the wild card that moves their household income up or down considerably or not, and how many family members they have to feed on that. I think the other piece of it is the cost of living, and if they're in a high cost of living area, and especially if they've come from a low cost of living area, that budget shift once you get there, recognizing that you were budgeting fine, you were managing your money just fine, and then you move to this cost of living area, high cost of living area, where everything is much more expensive, and you have to sort of rework the entire budget. So I think those cost of living in the area, household income, family size, are some of the best indicators of whether we're going to see food insecurity in that family. Oh, and recent relocation. Yep. Sorry, I forgot about that one. A recent relocation is also a piece, because there are lots of out-of-pocket, in addition to out-of-pocket housing costs, there are those out-of-pocket relocation costs that, you may get reimbursed for most of it, but there might be a lag. So during that time period before you get reimbursed, money gets a little tight. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, and I think we've even heard that from senior military officers married to working professional spouses, that's a real crunch time. And during relocation, there's a lot that the service member carries on their own and then gets reimbursed for months later. But sometimes that isn't enough to cover the gap in those moving expenses. I think too, there's some misperceptions as people are joining the military, that kind of the bigger the family you have, the more support you get, which the reality is there is a classification without or with dependents, right? So if you think of the monetary value of TRICARE for all of your children, yes, it is a higher level of support, or it's insurance you're not buying on the market for a larger number of people. But I think that's a misperception and a holdover from a lot of recruiting efforts in the past. I think it's interesting too, and I'll pose this question to each of you. How can we educate service members and their families? So Jessica, you touched on that need to recalibrate a budget when you're moving from one area to another. What resources are out there, and how have your organizations each dealt with the issue of educating the service members themselves to perhaps be a preventative intervention? Charlie, I'll start with you for that one.
Sure. Thanks very much, Kate. I think, first of all, it's a great question about how to educate those service members as they transition from one duty station to another. And Jessica, you hit a great point. I mean, you might leave a low cost area with a family of 4 and move to a high cost area. Yes, you're going to get probably a bump in BAH, but you're not getting a bump in your basic allowance for subsistence, and you're not getting a bump in your basic pay. So there's really nothing to compensate for that higher cost of living area for the average military family. Now, one of the things we've done in a couple of locations so far, and it's part of our strategic plan to implement across the board, is take a food support program and make it more than simply and not to say they're bad, but more than simply a food pantry per se, and instead provide an opportunity for a military family to roll up in their car and not only get food support, but also hear from resource providers They might be financial planners, they might be resume writers, they might be, across the board, any number of different folks that are there to provide assistance to get at those underlying causes of food insecurity or financial insecurity. So if a family needs to find out more about how to plan, maybe they've just arrived in San Diego from a lower cost area and they want to find out more about how to plan for life in San Diego, we'll have an opportunity for them to talk to somebody about doing just that. Again, I keep going back to the partnership word, but we do partner with DoD and the military branches. And one of the things that I would be very satisfied, very happy to have happen at our branches is have young military members come in looking for support and have us literally just vector them towards the right place on base or at the post to get that financial assistance training or financial planning training, whatever it is that I know organizations like Army Community Services, Navy, sorry, senior moment, I'm not thinking of the term now for the Navy. I know the military branches provide those services, and just far too often they're not sought because nobody. It seems that they're not as well known as they should be. So if we can be that connection point, that connective tissue, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, and there certainly are a lot of resources available on installations, and I think what we've seen in some of the reticence to go through the chain of command for help is being forced to sit through those. But I think if they're decoupled, so services are provided and the opportunity to learn how to manage your resources or to tailor them to your particular economy, local economy, I think that would be useful. Jessica, did you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like, I certainly budgeting and making sure that military families are financially literate and know how to plan a budget and work around that. That is going to be key. Of course, that's a first step that we can take. But there's also some challenges for that for military families. We know you can budget for an upcoming relocation, knowing that, I've been through 3 of these relocations. They always take money out of it always costs me money. So I know I'm going to need to save for it, but you don't necessarily know where you're going until a month or 2 ahead of time. Usually when we've asked about, how far in advance do you get your hard orders for your next duty station, it's somewhere around like 2 months for most people. And sometimes it's less than that. So you can save up a little bit of money to buffer that relocation cost. But if you only have 2 months to save up for San Diego when you're coming from Fort Polk, that's maybe not enough time to save up enough to make that transition smooth. So having advance notice about where you're going to go will certainly help. There's only so much you can do from the budgeting point of view. But certainly there are a lot of resources to help with, understanding what life is like at that next duty station so you can plan for it a little bit. And there's lots of resources on the installation as well to help with that, as well as the military serving organizations that can help.
Yeah, I think please.
I'm sorry, I want to tag on to something Jessica mentioned, and you mentioned it earlier as well, about those out-of-pocket expenses that are incurred when a military family PCSs. And yes, several of those expenses are reimbursable. Something that is not in Dr. Strong's purview, and it's not in my purview anymore, but it is definitely in the purview of the military branches. It's really incumbent upon them to get that reimbursement process liquidated and complete in a timely manner. And that is something that, there are specific organizations in each military branch that do that. It was always a focus for me when I was serving to make sure that my shipmates, my sailors were through that process, but I had no control of it. So all I'm saying is that those reimbursable expenses need to happen, and they need to happen before it becomes crunch time for the military family and they've now exceeded their budget.
Yeah, for sure. It goes up to, big Army, big Navy, and kind of feels out of the hands of the commander. And that's a real challenge. I have a question focused on data collection. So I know one of the challenges that we hear from local food banks besides Armed Services YMCA is that the approach in the food bank community is very much kind of no questions asked or as minimal information collected as possible in order to reduce the threshold for someone to choose to get help. But that could leave some gaps in looking at whether this is a consistent problem for the same families, whether we're seeing new families have issues. Is there any way that either of you have seen to kind of deal with the data question of how do you, on the one hand, try to track the efficiency and impact of your program, and on the other hand, providing that level of privacy to individuals so that they come forward to get resources? I'll pitch that one over to you, Charlie.
Okay, thanks. First of all, great question, and it's one that we struggle with because you're right. We need to have data about who we serve, how often we serve, especially with military families. We're interested in how many of them are coming to us with children. I'd like to be able to know what that diversity makeup is of the families that we serve to get at the points that Dr. Strong made earlier. But sometimes you're right, it's a challenge to get that data and also be as open and welcome as we want to be. We don't ask questions about a military family when they come into the door looking for food support. They're coming to us to say that they need it, then it's our assumption that they need it. We've had some real success stories. I'll highlight one in Fort Bragg where a young spouse came to us. She and her husband had recently arrived. Now they didn't have any kids at the time. She was college educated. She had a good job, and then this little thing called COVID hit. She lost her job due to COVID. She also found out she was pregnant, and her husband was deploying. And then things started to mount up on her, and she came to us for support. Found a very viable avenue that way, and in the end, she eventually worked her way back into the workforce. They did find childcare out in town, not very affordable though, and she's still working with us and actually volunteering at our branch at Fort Bragg now. Dr. Strong, you mentioned earlier you're from Fayetteville before. It's a great area, but a lot of need there.
Yeah, a lot of need and a big population too.
Yes.
Jessica?
Yeah, we've been there a few times during the course. I mean, Fort Bragg is one of those places that keeps bringing you back. If you're airborne qualified, you just keep going back there. So we're very familiar with Fort Bragg. It's a lovely area, but there is a lot of need there. There are a lot of military families, and so the need can be concentrated. I want to add on to the point that you made, Charlie, about we want to make the threshold as low as possible. We already know that military families do not seek help because of the shame and the stigma attached to it. So when we start asking questions when you come for help, then that shame and stigma starts bubbling up again. And it is so important that be secondary to the goal of getting people fed. And that's why I think partnership is so important. Decoupling the data collection from the food provision is something that we are able to do because we partner. Charlie can go provide the food and make sure that people are not hungry and they're eating. And that's what I think, I'm a little biased, but that's what I think is the benefit of a confidential survey that has nothing to do with service provision in the Military Family Lifestyle Survey. We can get information about whether you've accessed a food bank in the past year or whether your family is experiencing food insecurity in the past year without anybody else knowing about it from the comfort of your phone or computer. And that gives us a little bit of more ability to look at those demographic differences by region or race or ethnicity or employment status that I think it would feel too intrusive if you're trying to do it at the point of service provision.
Yeah, I think that's the toughest challenge of service provision. I'll turn to one more audience question, and then I'll leave the two of you with one final question. So the Congress has introduced the Basic Needs Allowance. How do you think that is going to change the the issue of food insecurity for military families, particularly those junior enlisted military families. Do you see that making a big impact and a move in the right direction, or is there more that needs to be done? I'll go to Jessica first on this one.
I mean, I think there's always more that could be done. The basic needs allowance certainly is a big first step. It's a step in the right direction. It's going to help. Like, I have no doubt that it will help alleviate some of the issue of food insecurity. But if it doesn't address the other root causes that are pushing families to food insecurity, it's not going to solve the whole problem. If we're not addressing childcare, if we're not addressing spouse employment, if we're not addressing housing costs and those other financial pressures, we're not going to fix the problem totally. We can relieve some of the issue, but it's not going to fix everything.
Charlie?
Yeah, I would first of all agree completely with Jessica on her assessment, and the simple reality that it's not one thing that's going to fix food insecurity. I would also say that, and I don't have the number in front of me, but as I understand it, the basic needs allowance is for a certain income level, but not above that level. And so I'm not sure what the percentage of people in the military that could benefit from it will actually be able to benefit from it, but I'm not sure that it's quite as broad-based as was originally hoped for.
Yeah, I agree on that. So to both of you, to wrap up today's discussion, which we very much appreciate your time, I'll pose one last question. So thinking about this from the level of readiness and national security, if people raise the question, why does food insecurity among military families matter? How would you answer that in a short answer? So Jessica, we'll turn to you.
So we know that most military families current military families have a family member in the past who has served in the military. We know military service is a family tradition for most of our military. And the bottom line is, if you grow up in a family that is food insecure, you're not going to look at military service as a lucrative career that is going to support the family that you have one day. So we got to make sure that everybody's basic needs are met if we want to recruit the next generation of military families.
And Charlie?
Yeah, great point, Jessica. And I think the number I've seen is something like 80% of our active force comes from a military family themselves. And since about something like 1% of our nation does volunteer to serve, I don't think that's a sustainable proposition, especially when, as you said, that 80% might see things like food insecurity as a reality of being in a military family and not make it attractive. The other thing from a readiness perspective, Kate, is those families that are serving today, and there's a significant number that are dual military families that I think this only becomes a greater challenge for. But those families that are serving, if the soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine are deployed downrange and away from their family, we all know where their focus is going to be a significant amount of time. And for me, having been in that position, it was always a better situation for me when I was able to focus on my job out at sea, wherever I was, without being concerned about what's happening at home. There are a lot of first world problems that happen, things like Wi-Fi being available or whatnot. That's fine. But for a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine to be deployed, trying to focus on their mission and also worrying about whether food is on the table at home, that's not a good readiness situation. That's a serious detractor on that individual's readiness, and that only impacts the command as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Charlie, Jessica, we really appreciate you coming on to have this important conversation with us. This certainly is intended to be the beginning of a broader conversation on the topic. We also want to sincerely thank Leonardo DRS, who supported this conversation today, and we appreciate their attention on the issue. So please stay tuned for future engagements. We're hoping to get some congressional and DoD key perspectives on the issue of military family food insecurity in the near future as the implementation plan rolls out and as the DAA comes to a close potentially today. We hope to see where that will go in the future. So thank you to our audience and please join us for our next conversation.